Yeah. All right. All right, everybody. This is the Mind Body Marathon podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Leo, and we have on the show today my Goonies, Dr. Matt and Zach Goulet. Today will be a nice, fun show about running form and, basically, which is a big issue. Running analysis and gait analysis have become a thing that a lot of people are doing. We're going to kind of delve into a little bit of what that means and what are some things you should pay attention to, and kind of just hit on some basic topics about running form and what that all really means. This is coming on sort of the coattails of I am releasing a book later this summer, and it will be about running form. And so I think at this time, I think it's important to sort of dissect this topic because I think there's a lot of misinformation out there, and we'll kind of delve into all that. So, but one of the biggest things I wanted to start with is when everybody's running, we can sort of pick out what everybody's form is. And Zach, when you think about running form, what comes to mind? What comes to mind as some important components?
Efficiency. So like efficiency and cadence. The other thing that kind of points out to me in terms of lack of running form is this concept of overstriding.
Yeah.
And longer stride equates to faster running, which that was something that when we grew up running was kind of like a big concept, was like lengthen out that stride. And now we know that that's probably not the most.
I know, it's amazing. I have so many people come in to the office and they're like, oh, well, I'm not going to be very fast because I'm short. And I'm like, that's actually an advantage.
Yeah.
Like most of the world record holders are actually pretty short. Being 6 foot like I am, that's actually a disadvantage.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for sprints, it can be okay, but for longer distance running, I mean, it's just more mass that you have to carry around. And yeah, I get your understanding of like stride length with that, but in the emphasis of if you can get, more cadence and a longer stride length based on how far you're jumping and not how far you're reaching, which those are two different conversations, I think that you can run faster ultimately with that. Matt, what do you think about, when you're sort of considering form?
I think about stability. I mean, even with overreaching, if you have long legs, if you're not stable with that, it doesn't have any advantage. You'd have to take shorter strides to keep and maintain your center of mass. So I think that's a big thing with, stability, not just in, your joints and your muscles, but also like how you flow through, your range of motion to that.
Yeah. With that topic, I sort of think of somebody who's muscular that's running downhill really fast.
Like a giant meatball.
Yeah.
And they're just like going like this with their arms and they're just going like crazy.
Exactly.
It's like a bowling ball that's like let loose down a hill.
But it's you say that, but then I just saw somebody post something about Wilt Chamberlain had a 2-minute 800 in high
that's
school.
insane.
Even though he has like the longest legs ever.
Yeah.
But because he was so stable and under his center of gravity, that was an advantage of, having a long stride.
I wonder how good Wilt would have been on those like cheese races in England.
Oh my gosh, just take him downhill. Dude, it would be like one step and he'd be down there.
Yeah. Just those interloping strides.
Long legs.
Yeah, well, that's just the thing. So stride length. Okay, so if we're talking about speed, let's just break running down. And I do this in the book in terms of the core idea of what is running. And running is basically jumping from one foot to the next. And if we're talking about speed, there's two variables. There's how frequent you jump from one foot to the next, and there's how far you jump from one foot to the next. And these are two different conversations, and these recruit two different aspects of our nervous system. Cadence, which is how frequent you're going to jump from one foot to the next, is a different conversation versus power output, which determines how far you are going to jump from one foot to the next. And obviously somebody like will jump farther based on the aspect that they are actually taller, but it is more strenuous to move that longer limb in space, so they lose out on the cadence aspect, which then makes them slower in the long term. So the trick is to be in the median somewhere, right in the bell curve, and to have a decent frequency with a ample stride length. That's the trick.
Is there a so based off of that, so like there's been an obvious like optimal 180 steps a minute, 90 steps per foot. But when we look at like height of person, does that variable change?
Yeah, that changes. It changes on a couple factors. So do you guys know why the 180 came about?
I honestly have no idea.
Yeah, I can't remember the exact.
Okay, so it has to do with tendon hertz. What is the max amount that a tendon can pulse?
Okay.
And it's 3 hertz, which 3 hertz is basically 3 pulses a second. So 3 times 60 is 180. So within 1 second, an Achilles tendon, a hamstring, a patellar tendon, an IT band can pulse at 3 hertz at its max. So then people were assuming, okay, well, that means that optimal frequency should be 180. Well, that it is at its max. So that means that some people can get there, maybe a 5'2" Mary Lou Retton, but not, a 7-foot,
Will Chamberlain.
Will
Yeah.
Chamberlain.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just not going to happen. So they can't pulse at that frequency. So yes, 100% accurate. The other thing that plays it, so Wilt would have a lower cadence because his tendons are larger. So a larger cable can't handle as much frequency. Does that make
Mhm.
sense?
Mhm.
So a smaller tendon or cable can handle more frequency. So that's why somebody who is over 6 foot will tend to be more towards 170, and that's fine. They should kind of hang out in the middle 170s. Somebody who is kind of mid, 5 feet up to kind of high 5 feet should be able to hit that 180 fine.
Is it a frequency thing that it can't handle, or is it just it takes more time for the muscle to actually react? Like his calf muscle is like this long.
Yeah.
And so for it to contract and relax again,
Yeah.
it takes so much time.
It's
that
literally time.
in a second, he can only do 2 as opposed to 3.
Right, but you have to wait for the tendon to recoil back.
Mhm.
And that's the other trick. But here's the other missing variable is the weight of the bones. So I remember treating Pete Kostalnik, who is a really, well accomplished distance runner, ultra marathoner, and he literally ran from Alaska to Florida. And shout out to you, Pete. That's ridiculous. 5,300
Man, that's
miles in like
crazy.
90 something days. It's insane. And I treated him. And then the very next treatment, I treated Clayton. And so Clayton Murphy, the 800 meter runner, Olympic bronze medalist, and their legs were the same length, but the weight was massively different. And Pete, because he can handle such crazy distances, had a much heavier leg. With his bone density was just massively heavier. And then Clayton being more bird-like, a little bit more of a bird-like frame, a lighter frame that could go faster than Pete. So because Pete literally had to move a heavier bone in space, he won't get to the 180, even though he has the same, dimensions. So it dimensions in terms of size, but not density. So bone density plays a role there too.
Interesting.
Which is a component that's completely under discussed within the community, and that's what I was hoping to flesh out, because I see these differences happen where if somebody wants to be more of a somebody like Jeremy Pope that we had on the podcast, he's a dense individual, he's a dense person. At one time he said on the podcast, he was heavier. When you're heavier, your bones get denser because they have to put up with more mass. Well, that's why he's a decorated distance runner now, ultra marathoner. He was used to being heavier, so his bones can handle an immense amount of strength, and torque because he just was heavier. It's a weird thought, but it's absolutely something that fleshes out in the math.
Have you ever treated somebody who had a bone density that wasn't correlated with the sport that they're doing, and you kind of know if they do that sport, they're gonna, it's man, this is gonna be a long road for you.
I just was having this conversation with somebody earlier today because it was actually an individual who since the 90s has worked on a farm that was kind of farm to table, or he was a chef, but he's worked on the farm as well, but he kind of worked farm to table since the 90s before it got popular. And we were talking a lot about our food sourcing and all that sort of stuff. And I was just like, dude, kids nowadays, they just can't handle the same workload. And I mean that genuinely. It's not that they're weaker. It's that they literally have poorer food and their bones and muscles just are not as strong as they used to be. I mean, just think of like Rodgers and those guys and Shorter. They ran in the crappiest shoes of all time. And in the 70s, they were hammering hundreds of miles a week.
Yeah. 150, 160 miles.
It's crazy to think about. Like we have these crazy super shoes now and people are struggling to get over 100 miles a week. Like literally like on the verge of like breaking down.
And now the thought is, I had somebody in a couple days ago or like last week, and they're like, I feel like since I've gone to the super shoes, I'm like more injured. And I'm like, well, I mean, I don't know how to navigate that.
My thought is on that. It's not that the super shoes. So this is, we're hitting a lot of, which is fine. We can go on some tangents, but my thought on that is not that the super shoes are actually necessarily creating the injury.
I agree.
They are allowing you to run faster. So imagine if you were to do overspeed down a hill consistently, you would get injured on that. Like running downhill when you're running faster, you would overreach the capacity of your muscles and tendons to handle torque. The shoes are basically putting you in a Porsche when you were used to driving a Honda Accord, and now you're not, you're going to get a speeding ticket. Like you're going to get injured. You're just not used to that speed. You're not used to that turnover and that power. And it's not necessarily that the shoes are like getting you injured. They're like giving you this gift of speed that you haven't adapted the body to.
That's kind of how I navigated that. Cause I think it's more, again, going back to what you said about form. It's more of a stability thing. Like when you think of form, you think of stability, and
there's a foundation component.
Well, look at any Piva racing shoe right now. If you can take your fingers and compress it like halfway through. And so that's just with your finger strength. So the average person has what, 20, 30 pounds of pressure. You're 100, 150, 200 pounds.
Yeah.
Now when you compress it, it becomes unstable.
Yeah.
And now your muscles have to overactivate to try and stabilize something that in a normal, stiffer running shoe wouldn't be there. That's why we're seeing huge increases of sacral stress fractures.
Weird stress fractures. Yeah. So I always say, like, people are like, well, what do the super shoes do? I'm like, all right, visually speaking, anybody that is watching this is how it works. It's like, basically it's the wave plates are set up like this so that when you land, they'll drop and then they'll kick back with kicking you forward. That's basically how they're designed. So they're preloaded with energy. You land and then they pop you back forward. Now that is that's free energy. Now you're jumping from one foot farther to the next, and all of a sudden your patellar tendon, your hamstring tendon, your Achilles tendon is like, wait, we're not used to landing a couple, centimeters farther than what you're doing here. So we have to like, decelerate these forces somehow. And all of a sudden these forces are like getting distributed across the body in ways that the body is not ready for. And then you will get injured. So I actually think that it's a rich get richer situation. If you are already a Kipchoge and you are already immensely stable and strong, then you will run out of your mind. But if you're the average Joe and you're not stable and your tendons aren't ready, then it could be a detractor. So you need to really understand that idea that, like, where are you at on the spectrum? It's not a negative thing. It's not a pejorative. It's not saying that like one is better than the other. It's saying that, you might not be strong enough and ready for that idea. Like, it's just like you would never put a 16-year-old in a Porsche. You just wouldn't do it. Like, they're gonna like obviously like wreck the car. They're not gonna understand how to drive something that fast. If you're not ready to go that fast in that shoe, you probably shouldn't run in that.
Yeah.
So when it comes to form and gait, because I look at that and I think that most people are still going to be sold on the super shoe. Like,
and they should be. I think it's a cool market.
But is there things that the general average Joe weekend warrior type person can do to help them with their gait, cadence, whatever that might be, so when they get into the super shoe, they feel more confident, comfortable?
Yeah, that's a phenomenal question. My answer to that would be, I feel like the missing link is tendon density and fascial density. And this kind of goes back to the idea of stability, like you alluded to, Matt, where that comes into play with tendon or more fascial density. What I mean by that is, if you want to build fascial density, one of the ways to do that is to broaden your spectrum of movement so that you build and strengthen fascial lines along the body. And then that provides this external passive support of tendons and joints.
Mhm.
And then if we want, so that a good example with that would be like something like Tai Chi or capoeira or, strenuous yoga moves where you're going to be doing like long sustained holds for long periods of time, strengthening certain aspects of the body. That's a concept that I feel like is underutilized in the running world. But to build tendon density is an easier conversation. That's basically sprinting, like hill strides, or plyometrics and like ballistic movements. That's really the only thing that'll mainly develop tendons.
Is there a certain duration or frequency that you would do those?
Yeah. So what I would say is a minimum dosage. So say, again, in the book, there's ways that I'm going to describe to you how to analyze your own tendons to basically assess like where you're at on the spectrum of tendon density. Because everybody's on a different spectrum. Some people are just gifted with great tendons and they can high jump they can high jump through the roof. Some people just don't have great tendons like me and they can barely touch the backboard on a basketball hoop.
That's okay.
I'm 6 foot, but I can barely touch backboard. And so I don't have great tendon density, so it's one of those things where I think a minimum dosage of a couple times a week is critical. I think the most important aspect is during the base phase, not during the peak of the season when you're trying to peak. And I actually think that the way that you should analyze it is every 10 minutes of plyometrics is equivalent to 1 mile of running. And I think that's a great way to break up volume so you don't overwork yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great concept. Yeah, those like old running form days that we had, that's stuck out to me when we would do the running forums or classes a couple of years ago.
Yeah, no, I agree. And we should definitely get back to that. I feel like there is this weird idea that distance running doesn't require coordination.
Hmm.
But it does.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
It requires immense coordination. Like if you watch watching the Olympics later this summer, and let's just say let's watch the 800, and these guys are all packed together and they're racing and it's all tight. Do you know how much coordination it takes to not like unravel that pack? To like one guy, like they're like literally millimeters from each other's heels at any given moment. And it's immense amount of like biofeedback constantly. So they are assessing the changes in pacing and the surging and then the
slight elbow bumps,
and everything, like all the nuances of like making that pack work. I mean, it's like in biking, when we watch Tour de France, it's like
that's scary.
Those tires are like so darn close. And if they touch, it's like obliteration.
Yeah, it's done.
It's done.
It's done.
And that takes coordination. Now, coordination comes on two fronts. There is broadening the aspect of muscle activation, which comes in the form of like Tai Chi, capoeira, yoga, Pilates, that kind of stuff. Doing rock climbing is a great example of this, where you're broadening your muscle activation. But it comes in the secondary form of shutting down unnecessary muscles during running. That's improved by sprinting and plyometrics. Because plyometrics, what you're doing is you're telling your legs to do a very specific movement, and then you're telling the rest of the muscles to shut up. So you need to be able to learn how to activate those muscles to turn them off. That's the brilliance of running. The brilliance of running is not to just like hammer the cardiovascular system. The brilliance is to broaden your brain's spectrum of muscle activation so that you can quiet it down.
And feel confident.
And that's why when you watch like like I'm wearing an Ethiopian jacket, you watch like the Ethiopians in the Olympics and their faces bouncing and their bodies bouncing and they're running. It looks like they're running like effortlessly. It's because they do a crazy amount of plyometrics to learn how to shut off every single muscle in their body that is not directed to running. And that takes coordination.
People need to go. There's like videos on YouTube that you can watch of like those camps of them like in a yoga studio on like wooden blocks doing like coordinated like skipping to like drum beats. And
dude,
it's
100%.
It's fascinating.
Like you watch
so cool.
I had numerous Kenyan teammates at Malone, and they would do these like snappings and clicking under their feet and stuff. They would like basically dance while they're doing plyometrics. And then the average distance runner can like not cut up a rug. The average distance tripping over their feet, can't play basketball, can't do anything
Super stiff.
and they're super stiff and rigid and just very uncoordinated. And it's like, that's not great. That means you can't shut off those muscles while you're running because you've literally never learned how to communicate to those muscles.
Which still seems to me like most of it being a neurological thing. Your brain can't basically turn on and off switches. So like you have two switches, one has to go up and one has to go down, and it's the same as any muscle. You have one that contracts it and the other one has to elongate it.
Right.
But if you're constantly staying under tension, which in some cases of the gait, you'll be in, tension in both, for stabilization, but in the free flight phase of it, one has to relax or both have to relax. And if you're not good at doing it, then you're just wasting energy.
Dude, I think there's no greater example than the hamstring. Like you hear of like, I mean, how many of our cases are hamstring injuries?
Over half.
Yeah.
I mean, it's in a minute.
That's for me at least.
Northeast Ohio,
Dude,
during the spring, everybody.
There's like not a person on the planet that's like, my hamstrings feel great.
Northeast Ohio is one big strained hamstring.
It is. 100% is.
Everybody just comes through the door. You're like, this is honestly a hamstring case.
Track season is the worst.
What's so funny is that everybody acts like it's a unique thing to them. They're like, dude, my hamstrings are tight. I'm like the only person. It's like you and everybody else.
Yeah.
Look, if you're looking at the running form, let's break the running form up into 3 cycles. Like the leg comes down to lands. Right before it's about to land, the leg has to kick out. Well, that's basically the only action of the hamstring. Then the hamstrings contract, drop the leg down towards landing. Once you land and you push off, that is not the hamstring's job. But most people, that's the case because their glutes are shut off. And then the leg cycles through and they have this, what I call 2-phased knee drive, where they bend the knee to shorten the lever, then they lift the thigh. Bending the knee will require you to contract the hamstring. But in a perfect form, what you would do is you would bend the knee and flex the hip at the same time, which does not require hamstring activation.
That's my issue.
So then all of a sudden, you have most people are running with the hamstring active in literally the 3 major phases of running, instead of the hamstring being active in just one phase. So if you go, okay, let's just do the math. The hamstring's working 3 times harder while you're running. Obviously, it will fail. It's not because they're tight or whatever. They're just screaming at you. Please, God, like change your form so we're not like overloading it. Yeah. So that like concept of like the 2-phase knee bend and the hip flexion is kind of a difficult concept to grasp. And you should definitely check out our like YouTube pages for that, because I feel like that's like the critical component there. But it just comes down to like general coordination of your leg and how you're moving your leg in space. 2-phased, bending, leg up. 1 phase, leg up. 2-phase, bending, leg up. 1 phase, 2 phase. 1 phase.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that's your issue? I don't feel like that.
Every time you'll analyze me, I always do that 2-phase.
Oh, the 2-phase, yeah.
Like it's not bad. Like it's very subtle. Like we've seen it worse on other people, but yeah, that's
so basically what that means is like if you're swinging you're kicking your leg back. If you're going to swing your leg back to the front, like you're scissoring your legs in space because you're jumping from one foot to the next, it's easier to move a leg that's shorter than a leg that's longer. Okay. So like if your arm carriage is like this, it's easier to move your arm while it's shorter versus if your arm is longer, then it's harder to move. It's just simple physics. Like the closer a structure is contained to its center of mass, the faster it can move along a pendulum.
Think of an ice skater twirling around. The closer they bring their arms,
yes,
the faster they
the faster they spin. Exactly. That's a great idea. So the closer the mass comes to the limb comes to the center of mass, the faster you can move it in space. Right. So that's how like people who skydive too, like when they separate their arms, they slow down. When they bring their arms close, they spin quicker. Now, people almost literally everybody makes the error of bending the knee first and then shortening the leg to drive it forward. The problem with that is you could just literally do both at once. You could literally, once the foot pushes off, you can drive the knee straight up. That will also compress the limb in space. And then you save so much time on the leg swing. that is almost single-handedly one of the most important forms of gait to switch.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So for distance runners specifically, like let's say like middle distance to distance runners, and maybe I'm talking more to like the collegiate high school athlete, but is it more beneficial for a distance oriented runner to improve cadence by doing what we said, like plyometrics, like doing some sort of like yoga or like Pilates or something like that? Or should they still be doing hurdle drills? Like we do hurdle drills, like going up and over, down and under. Like, is that,
Well, what's the point of hurdle drills?
I think, to work on containing your form, like working on, like, the way that I look at that is you can work on keeping things in a very contained manner. So you're not,
I don't think that's how most people look at it. I think you're right. I think that's the right way to look at hurdle drills. Basically, hurdle drills are when like coaches will advise athletes to sort of like step over hurdles and stump under them to sort of like get your brain to understand this concept of like crunching the body together. But I think most coaches will look at it for hip mobility.
that's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
Most
Which I
most-
think is an error because, like, you know, in the end, unless you're like a freaking sprinter, it's like who needs a ton of hip mobility, anyways? I mean, you do need some, but like for the most part, not really. It's a little overblown, in my opinion. But I feel like it's about the coordination of it. It's about the coordinating what we call triple flexion and
Mhm.
triple extension, which is basically coordinating the flexion of the hip, the knee, and the ankle at the same time, while then you let the leg go in triple extension, extending the hip, knee, and ankle at the same time. So that's kind of, I think, the most important concept. But no, I think that's actually a poor form of getting somebody to increase their cadence. I don't think that's a meaningful component of that. I
Mhm.
feel like hurdle drills are like maybe a way to increase the coordination of a runner,
Right.
and that's about it, to be honest with you. But I don't think coaches are understanding it that way.
Would you say hip extension or ankle flexion is a bigger issue?
I would
Most
say
distance runners.
I think they're both
Mm.
probably equally terrible, but I almost would say that if we're talking about literal dorsiflexion of the ankle,
Mhm.
I think that might be one of the most underrated aspects of form because the dorsiflexing the ankle is basically where you draw the toes to the shin. And so say you're pushing off, you're running and you're pushing off, immediately you should be drawing the toes towards the shin every time that your foot is in flight. When that is the case, you will instantly activate the hip flexors, which then get you out of this two-phased running crap that we were talking about. You should definitely, it'll definitely help you with the single phase knee drive forward. Okay, dorsiflexion. Toes up. So push off, toes up. Toes up. And I feel like that will fix a lot of issues because the quicker the leg can drive forward, the more force it can drive down into the ground.
I only asked just because I feel hip extension would tense the hip flexor quicker
And then snap it
and then
forward.
snap it
Yeah.
forward.
Yeah. So that's the thing. That's what I was talking about earlier with Zach when we were talking about that hip mobility stuff. It's like, yeah, I mean, I feel like hip mobility is important, but in a weird way, you want some structures to be decently tense so they snap through with more motion.
Now-
And this is the same conversation with the hamstrings.
Yeah. And going back to the dorsiflexion of the ankle, that would be, in my mind, one concept that hurdle drills could help with.
Yes, because you have to clear the hurdle.
You do have to
dorsiflex.
clear the hurdle. Yeah.
Exactly.
So that's something that could be reinforced.
Yeah. So
and-
like if you're
Yeah.
watching, you have to step over the hurdle. So you have to learn how to bend the toes towards the shin. Imagine if you're like, you know, walking and, you know, you have a kid in the house and the kid leaves a toy and you don't pick up the front of your foot and you clip the toy, you're going to trip. Well, dorsiflexion is where you pick up the front of your foot so you clear the toy. All right. And you don't trip. And that is critical for running. It's literally so important that even when you're running easy, every single time your foot is off the ground, you bring your toes towards your shin. This would save so much people from grief. I can't even explain to you how much grief this would save. You'll be so much faster. You'll pick so many injuries. It's insane. We can talk. We are going to have a whole episode about how that's important.
Dive through that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's, and I think the cadence conversation, I generally say, 170 to 185.
Yeah.
I think if you're over 185, you're reckless. If you're in a race, it's going to be higher. I get that. So don't look at your cadence when you're running a race. That will naturally be higher. Don't be that person. Don't be that person that looks at your cadence when you're running a workout. That's going to be higher. We all get that. Look at your cadence when you're running easy, when you're bopping around town, just, going to run down the street at easy 4 mile. I was going to say going down to get some JoJo's for Matt.
Yeah. Dude, his turnover would be 190.
Matt, what is your turnover, by the way?
Usually 168.
Matt is amazing. He is one of the stiffest runners I've ever seen.
Yeah, and that's actually improved. When I first came into the practice, I was probably around 158.
Yeah.
At my peak, probably when we were at the first clinic, I was 174.
Yeah.
Is the best that I got to.
Yeah.
He always looks like he's running with a bunch of school kids, just kind of matching their cadence.
Just showing them up for the end sprint.
So that's one of the things that cadence is hard to change.
It's neurological.
It's neurological, and you have to practice it, and it can make running kind of boring because you have to think about always
and uncomfortable too.
So this is the other thing. So people are like, well, how do I improve my cadence? I'll go, okay. The best way is you have to count it while you're running.
Yeah.
It'd be like saying, like, imagine you were part of a band and then the whole show, the whole night, you're a quarter cadence off.
Yeah. Your drummer's off.
Dude, you're like, you have to know real time if you're on spot. And then at the end of the show, everybody's like, dude, that sounded terrible. Your drums are way off. You need to know.
Yeah.
So when you're running, you can't just end the run and go, oh, what was my cadence? No, you can't do that. You have to count it. It's literally like music. Your cerebellum, which houses your concepts of music and understanding music, is literally also the same thing that deals with muscle contraction. And so it literally craves this idea of timing, and you should literally count. So just clock a minute on your watch and count how many times you strike the foot on, and within a minute, 1 foot, like Zach said, it's 90 or 85 to 90. That's 170, 180. And you should do this on your easy runs. You should not think about this on your workouts. You should not think about this on your races. It should only be on your easy runs.
What about long runs?
Also on your long runs, as long as you're not doing a workout within it. But yeah, I mean, running 10 years professionally and 20 years total, it's like at this point, I still count my cadence. It's something you never leave. It's like, it's not like a drummer thinks they're so cocky that they never have to time up with the band. You every single day you have to time up with the band to make sure you're on cue.
They make products too. I know, for people who run with phones, I do not run with a phone. They have different apps that will, have a metronome, like a running metronome that will, keep count. You just have to set it.
Yeah.
I know that there's some data that shows that there's Spotify has an app where you can pick songs, but it's too hard to pick out the specific beat.
There's like a app, there's playlists that do 180 kind of cadence. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of cool. And if you do run with music, which I'm not hating on you, but that would be kind of a cool thing you could do.
I know in high school, I used to have one of those little step counters, like the pedometers.
Yeah.
But it just made a chirp for your beat. And so I would just set it. And I had a really good one that had headphones so nobody else had to hear it.
No way I could do that.
Those foam headphones, dude.
Yeah, they're just horrible. And I let a patient borrow it and they took it. They never had it. But that was how I got to 174.
They took your
They took your headphones?
Yeah, not the headphones, but just the little device. But it was audible tone is the best thing to just cue you to increase your cadence.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
That's why I think, every now and again, run without music, listen to your foot strikes, listen to the beat, listen to the sound of it all. There is a rhythm to it. If you are a trail runner, pop on the road every now and again, just so you can hear the rhythm of the foot strikes. That's the advantage of running on a predictable surface, like a track or a road, so that you can get that. And I agree, the music thing every now and again can be beneficial. The other thing that's important, and Matt, you like this, what do you bike at? What are your revolutions on biking? Have you counted those?
So I usually am at like 80 to 160.
That's really low, dude.
Yeah. Well,
you should be at like 90 on the bike.
so I'm 84.
Dang.
Yeah.
I don't know mine. I haven't biked in forever, so
But for shorter
Last time I
distance,
biked with you, you popped your chain.
yeah. So I was going probably like 120.
yeah, for shorter distance. But from what I've gathered from a lot of people in the riding community, they're usually, if they're pushing the speed that I typically am from a resistance side, they're not getting,
Yeah.
to
I
that,
mean, if you're
so,
watching the tour, they're 90 plus.
yeah.
If you bike, if you're on the Peloton every now and again or do some biking, like if you work into that rhythm of 90 cycles per minute, that is, if you double that, obviously, that's 180, and that'll sort of work into your nervous system, the timing
Mhm.
aspect of what it should be like when you're running. So that's all I was bringing that up
Yeah.
for. I think that's a decent way to sort of train that.
I think that's probably the most efficient way to train it.
It is, because you sort of understand that it feels a little reckless at first, like you're almost like a hamster in a cage kind of a thing.
Mhm.
But then eventually you get used to that turnover, and it feels like home.
I was thinking when Matt was talking about the products that he uses, like, those cartoons when like they start to like run too fast and they turn into like that dust circle with their face. That's me with those things. Terrible with those things. I tried it and I can't get it.
Those dust bunnies.
I mean, and that's a point too to make, is you have to differentiate steps per minute versus speed.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so that's a
Well,
huge
okay,
That's a
yeah.
really
Cadence
good
is
point.
not pace.
Yes.
That's critical.
And I have so many people, not so much now, but like back like
Yeah.
5 years ago,
They'll be
they're
like, I'm
"I
not very
can't do it."
fast. I
Yeah.
can't. I'm like, dude, it has nothing
Like
to
I
do
can't
with
keep the cadence because I get out of breath.
Yeah. And I was like, what are you doing? I'm like,
Yeah.
you're just increasing the number of steps per
Just
minute.
running
You're not
faster.
actually going
Dude,
fast.
Like
Yeah.
I always say, like think of bouncing a basketball. You can bounce a basketball like this, like pace is point A to point B. But you could also go bump, 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 bump. Like obviously you can be at a different cadence, and point A to point B is not the same thing as cadence.
Mhm.
So I think that's important for people to sort of understand. Yeah, I feel like this was kind of a good foray into kind of gait and some of my
Yeah.
qualms with gait analysis and form training and everything. I would say the biggest thing that I want to kind of, maybe the last major point I want to hit, is that there is no perfect running form, that everybody is unique in their sense of what they can do from a running form standpoint.
Mhm.
You have to take into consideration, joint mechanics, muscular strength, nervous system capabilities. There's a lot of components to take into. And this is something that I allude to in my book. And I think that it's important for everybody to sort of understand that, when you watch somebody run in the Olympics, like you will literally still see everybody with different forms. There is not an optimal running form, that everybody's efficiency is based on a bunch of different parameters. And I think it's important for everybody to understand what those parameters are, which we can further cover in another episode. But don't get hung up on so and so has the perfect form and I'm going to try to run like them. You might actually be doing yourself a disservice.
Yeah.
And I would just hunker down on the idea of cadence, sort of develop the concept of like a smoother moving in space, with the one phase running form rather than the two phase. We sort of alluded to that. Yeah. And so, Zach, any tips you have for anybody kind of trying to improve their running form?
Just be patient. Take your time with it. I would say, like, if you're working on it, work on it again, like we said, on those easy days, work on those days where you don't have to like think too much. And again, just be patient with it.
Yeah. I mean,
What do you think?
it's not like cycling where you can get on a bike and like actually measure like all these outputs, of power and velocity and all this stuff. And then, shift your seat forward just slightly and see how it changes. So it's one of those things where like, you can't just be like, oh, I'm going to increase my cadence by 4. Oh, I ran 30 seconds, faster, that run. Because you're going to run inevitably a little bit quicker,
Yeah.
but that might be sustainable for that one run. But if you do
Right.
that over a period of time, so I think like Zach said, do it easily. During the easy runs, I've made many mistakes of running, and trying to like think about it during hard workouts is one of them that I can think of, and it backfired completely. So
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like if you are playing into the individual components of your own form and strength and range of motion, that if you improve all of those variables, your cadence will naturally improve.
Mm-hmm.
And not that we're even just hunkering down on cadence, but your form in general will naturally improve, because that's just like an easy objective variable that everybody can sort of assess. But if you do gait analysis and you hunker down on a lot of these components that you need to improve upon, you'll literally find that your brain will naturally adapt to a more efficient form, because running is actually the most advanced non-learned behavior we can do. I'll let that sink in. Somebody could be 100% mentally retarded and know how to run. When is the last time that any parent on this planet has ever had to teach one of their kids how to run? Like, the kids just naturally start doing it on their own. It is the most advanced, non-learned. It's ingrained in your brain based on 2 reflexes, which I allude to. And it's important that you understand that it is ingrained in the brain. And the more you improve the body, the more you improve the range of motion, the strength, you will naturally improve your gait. That's the way to approach it, not by just telling somebody, oh, you shouldn't move your arm that way and you should, try not to heel strike. That's wrong. You have to get stronger first. That's putting the cart before the horse. And once you get stronger, then you'll naturally improve.
I mean, an easy way to look at it, have somebody video you at the beginning of a training cycle, and then about 2 weeks before your race, when you're in pretty much optical, hopefully not injured, you'll look completely different on film with that.
Right.
You'll just like literally your hips will be more stable.
Yeah, because this season you would have gotten stronger, and your tendons are thicker and everything. Yeah. All right. Well, I feel like this was another great episode, and be sure to follow us and kind of follow the podcast, and be sure to give us some comments and some feedbacks, and moving forward, also keep an eye out for some things we're going to be releasing, and some new material and things like that too. So there's some fun stuff coming up on the horizon for the summer. So thanks everybody for watching, and thanks everybody for listening. All the best.